That single sentence shattered the illusion millions of viewers had believed for over a decade. Because Sister Wives was never just about plural marriage. It was about balance, about fairness, about a promise that love could be multiplied without anyone being diminished. And yet, somehow, one wife became the center of everything. The rules changed, the tone shifted, and the family that once preached unity slowly began orbiting around a single person. The shocking part isn't that the marriages ended. It's how predictably they ended and how long everyone pretended not to see it. Because if you go back to the beginning, the signs were always there. In the pauses, in the way certain conversations stopped when one person entered the room, in the way Cody's voice softened for one wife and hardened for the others. And if you think that's dramatic, wait until you hear the exact moment the power shifted. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. When Sister Wives first aired, it didn't feel like scandal television or manufactured drama. It felt like a social experiment wrapped in hope and confidence. The premise was radical, but presented as thoughtful and intentional. One man, 4 wives, 1 family. Not chaos, not rivalry, not emotional neglect, but balance, honesty, and shared sacrifice. They spoke to the audience as if inviting the world into something misunderstood, promising that love wasn't meant to be divided but multiplied, that jealousy could be managed with communication, and that emotional maturity could overcome what outsiders assumed would be inevitable failure. In those early episodes, there was a lightness that now feels almost haunting to rewatch. Christine laughed easily then, the kind of laughter that comes from feeling secure, from believing you belong somewhere without having to fight for your place. She moved through the family space with warmth and confidence, joking with the kids, teasing Cody, comfortable in her role and certain of her importance. Janelle, by contrast, carried herself with calm logic and steady restraint. She spoke thoughtfully, often about finances, logistics, and long-term planning, grounding the family with practicality rather than emotion. She didn't seek constant reassurance because she trusted the structure itself. She believed the system would protect her, and Mary still believed she mattered in a deeply personal way. Not just as the first wife on paper, not as tradition or symbolism, but emotionally. You could see it in the way she leaned forward during conversations, in how she spoke with the confidence of someone who believed her voice still shaped decisions, who believed her years of loyalty had earned her security that couldn't be undone. Then Robin arrived, and she arrived differently. She didn't come carrying decades of shared history, old arguments, inside jokes, or quiet resentments built over years of compromise. She came with something far more powerful: possibility. She represented a fresh start, an untouched version of the dream they had all signed up for. Where the other wives had already paid the emotional cost of plural marriage, learning when to swallow disappointment, when to step back, when to be strong, Robin stepped into the family before those costs had shaped her. She was younger, yes, but more importantly, she was emotionally open in a way the others had learned not to be. Her voice softened when she spoke. Her eyes filled quickly. She expressed vulnerability without apology. And that vulnerability drew something out of Cody that had long been dulled by years of managing competing needs and expectations. From the very beginning, Cody didn't just love Robin, he protected her. It showed in subtle ways at first. The way he explained things more gently to her, the way he stepped in to clarify her intentions when another wife questioned something she said, the way his body naturally angled toward her during group conversations, as if signaling without words where his emotional attention rested. At the time, it looked romantic. It looked like a man rediscovering excitement, rediscovering tenderness. And the other wives told themselves that was fine, even healthy. After all, wasn't love supposed to be celebrated? Weren't they taught that jealousy was something to overcome, not indulge? But protection has a quiet shadow side, one that's easy to miss when you're trying to be fair and generous. Protection slowly turns into preference when no one is watching closely enough. And preference, once established, reshapes everything. The change didn't announce itself with a dramatic argument or a clear turning point. It crept in through tiny, accumulating moments that were easy to dismiss on their own. A hug that lingered just a little longer. A conversation that happened privately and was never fully shared with the group. A decision that was framed as a discussion even though the outcome already felt decided. Each moment was small enough to rationalize, to excuse, to wave away as coincidence or sensitivity. Together, they formed a pattern. Christine noticed first, though she didn't yet have the words for it. You could see it in the brief tightening of her smile, in the way her eyes flickered before she pulled herself back together. Janelle noticed too, but she processed it analytically, filing it away as imbalance that could be corrected with time, structure, and reason. Mary felt it most deeply because for her, attention had always been emotional currency, and slowly, that currency was losing its value. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud, because in plural marriage, naming favoritism is dangerous. It threatens the entire foundation. So instead of confrontation, there was accommodation. The wives adjusted themselves around the new reality. They waited longer. They asked less. They rationalized more. They told themselves Robin was new, that she needed reassurance, that things would even out once she found her footing. But they didn't even out, they shifted. Cody, perhaps without fully realizing it, began relying on Robin emotionally in ways he hadn't relied on the others for years. She listened with fresh ears. She validated his frustrations. She mirrored his feelings instead of challenging them. And slowly, quietly, without a single explosive moment, the promise that had hooked America, the idea of balance, equality, and shared love, began to crack. Not because anyone meant to break it, but because in that silence, something fundamental had already changed. The favoritism didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It seeped in quietly, the way dampness creeps into the walls of a house long before anyone notices the smell. In the early days, the family still told themselves everything was equal, that whatever adjustments were happening were temporary, reasonable, even necessary. Robin was new, they reminded themselves. New wives always required more attention at first. That was the rule they'd lived by for years. But something about this time felt different. Even if no one could yet articulate why, the first signs weren't dramatic. They were subtle, almost invisible, unless you were living inside the dynamic. Cody's tone shifted when he spoke to Robin. Softer, more patient, less defensive. When she expressed hurt or confusion, he leaned in, listened longer, validated her feelings instead of explaining them away. With the other wives, especially Christine and Mary, his responses had become quicker, sharper, more corrective over time. He no longer asked how they felt so much as why they felt that way. Robin, on the other hand, was rarely asked to justify her emotions. They were treated as self-evident, reasonable, deserving of protection. At first, this was framed as kindness. No one wanted to begrudge Robin that. Kindness, after all, was supposed to be the currency of plural marriage. But kindness began to accumulate unevenly, and that imbalance created tension no one wanted to name. Family meetings started to feel different. Discussions still happened around the same table, but the energy had shifted. Decisions were increasingly shaped before the conversation even began. Someone would bring up a concern, and Cody would already have an answer, often one that aligned neatly with Robin's needs or preferences. The conversation would then move toward consensus, but it was a consensus formed around a center that no longer moved. Christine noticed it in her body before she fully understood it in her mind. She would sit quietly, hands folded, waiting for a pause that never quite came, sensing that her input carried less weight than it once did. When she did speak up, the response was often dismissal masked as reassurance. "You're overthinking," Cody would say, or "That's not what's happening." Those phrases landed heavily, not because they were cruel on their own, but because they erased her lived experience. Janelle, ever the pragmatist, tried to analyze the shift logically. She told herself this was about logistics, not favoritism, about schedules, not emotion, about managing complexity in a growing family. but even she couldn't ignore the patterns forming beneath the surface. When resources were discussed, time, money, attention, Robin's household increasingly emerged as the baseline around which everything else was arranged. It wasn't that the others were explicitly denied. It was that they were expected to adapt their expectations, adapt their patience, adapt their sense of self-worth. Mary felt the shift most acutely because for her, emotional proximity had always been the measure of safety. She had already endured years of feeling sidelined, of watching her relationship with Cody grow colder, more distant. Robin's arrival didn't just highlight that distance, it widened it. Where Mary's attempts at closeness were met with frustration or discomfort, Robin's need for reassurance was met with immediate response. And the cruel irony was that Mary couldn't even express her pain without being labeled jealous or bitter. In a family that prided itself on emotional honesty, there were suddenly feelings that were no longer acceptable to voice. Favoritism, after all, was a taboo subject. To accuse a husband of it was to accuse the entire system of failure. So instead, the wives turned inward. They adjusted. They made themselves smaller in ways that were almost imperceptible from the outside. Christine stopped insisting on equal time and started framing her needs as requests rather than expectations. Janelle retreated further into practicality, focusing on work and independence, telling herself that emotional distance was manageable as long as stability remained. Mary oscillated between trying harder and withdrawing completely, caught in a painful loop of hope and disappointment. Robin, meanwhile, often appeared genuinely confused by the tension. From her perspective, she wasn't taking anything. She was simply responding to what was being offered. Cody came to her. He confided in her. He sought her validation. She didn't have to ask for center stage. It was slowly built around her. And every time conflict arose, Cody's instinct was to shield her from discomfort. If another wife expressed frustration, the focus shifted quickly to how Robin felt about the tension. How hard it was for her to feel accepted. How painful it was for her to be blamed. In protecting Robin from emotional harm, Cody inadvertently positioned her as fragile, and fragility became power. The more she was protected, the more the family revolved around keeping her comfortable. Over time, this created an unspoken hierarchy. Robin's emotional well-being became a priority. The other wives' resilience became an expectation. They were strong after all. They'd handled worse. They could handle this too. But strength, when assumed rather than appreciated, becomes a burden. The family rarely acknowledged this out loud, but it showed in the silences, in the way conversations ended abruptly, in the way certain topics were avoided altogether, in the way the wives began choosing their words carefully, editing themselves before speaking. And Cody, perhaps unaware of the cumulative effect of his choices, grew increasingly defensive when the imbalance was hinted at. Any suggestion that Robin was favored was met with denial or anger. He framed himself as misunderstood, accused the others of rewriting reality, insisted that his actions were fair even as the emotional evidence mounted against him. This defensiveness only deepened the divide. Because when people feel unseen, being told they're wrong about their own feelings doesn't resolve conflict, it confirms it. The favoritism became most evident not in grand gestures, but in moments of stress. When tensions ran high, Cody gravitated toward Robin for comfort. When decisions were difficult, he sought her counsel first. When conflict erupted, he worked to restore peace in her household before addressing the fallout elsewhere. Slowly, the message became clear, even if no one said it outright. Harmony was defined by Robin's sense of security, and everything else was secondary. The other wives adapted in different ways. Christine tried to communicate her pain more clearly, but each attempt seemed to push Cody further away, reinforcing her sense that honesty now came at a cost. Janelle grew increasingly independent, both emotionally and financially, a quiet acknowledgement that she could no longer rely on the family structure to meet her needs. Mary lingered in emotional limbo, attached to a version of the family that no longer existed, hoping that loyalty might eventually be rewarded. And through it all, Robin remained at the center. not as a villain plotting control, but as the axis around which everything turned. The tragedy of this phase wasn't that anyone set out to hurt anyone else. It was that no one stopped the drift once it became apparent. The system itself discouraged confrontation, rewarding silence over honesty and patience over accountability. And so the favoritism, once subtle, became structural. It shaped decisions, conversations, and relationships in ways that were impossible to undo. By the time anyone was willing to name it for what it was, the damage had already been done. The family still shared a name, still filmed scenes together, still spoke the language of unity. But underneath that language was a growing realization, one that settled heavily in each wife's chest in her own way. The equality they were promised was no longer real. And once that realization took hold, once the illusion cracked, it could never be fully repaired. The rules arrived wearing the language of responsibility, but they carried something far heavier beneath the surface. By the time they were fully introduced, the family was already fragile, stretched thin by years of unspoken imbalance. What made these rules different wasn't just their strictness, it was how selectively they seemed to apply. On paper, they were framed as necessary, even noble, a way to protect the family, the children, and the future they claimed to still share. But in practice, the rules became a magnifying glass, exposing what many had tried not to see for a long time. Suddenly, access mattered more than affection. Permission mattered more than partnership. Who could visit, who could hug, who could sit close, who had to stay away. These weren't just logistical decisions anymore. They were emotional verdicts. Christine felt it immediately. She stood at doorways instead of crossing thresholds, waved from driveways instead of sitting at kitchen tables. The physical distance mirrored an emotional one that had already been growing, and now it had rules to justify it. Each time she questioned why things felt so uneven, the answer came back wrapped in authority rather than empathy. This is what we have to do. This is for everyone's safety. This isn't personal. But it felt personal because the consequences were not evenly shared. While some households existed in near isolation, others felt strangely untouched by the same restrictions. Robin's home, in particular, seemed insulated from the loneliness that defined the rest of the family's experience. Cody was there more often. The routines continued. The sense of togetherness remained intact. From the outside, it could be explained away as compliance. Robin followed the rules more strictly, therefore she earned access. But from the inside, that explanation rang hollow because compliance had quietly become a moving target. The rules were not just about behavior, they were about trust. And trust was no longer distributed equally. Janelle tried to navigate this terrain with reason. She studied the rules, weighed the risks, and attempted to balance independence with connection. But even her logic faltered under the emotional cost. She found herself questioning not just the fairness of the rules, but the intention behind them. Were they truly about safety, or were they about control? About convenience? About protecting one household's sense of normalcy at the expense of everyone else's? Mary, meanwhile, experienced the rules as confirmation of a loss she had felt long before they were ever written down. For her, distance was not new. But now it had structure. Now it had justification. The absence of connection could be explained without addressing the deeper wound underneath. Each denied visit, each missed moment, reinforced the feeling that she existed on the periphery, bound by obligation rather than desire. And every time she tried to express that pain, it was reframed as resistance, as negativity, as a failure to support the family. The language used to enforce the rules became just as damaging as the rules themselves. Questions were treated as challenges. Concerns were labeled as selfishness. Emotional reactions were framed as proof of instability. The more someone struggled, the less credible their perspective became. In contrast, calm acceptance was rewarded. And nowhere was that more visible than in Robin's position. Her adherence to the rules was praised. Her household became the example. And in becoming the example, it became the standard by which all others were measured, regardless of whether that standard was realistic or humane. Cody leaned into this framework with increasing rigidity. Where once he might have negotiated or reassured, he now enforced. His tone hardened, his patience thinned. He spoke less like a partner and more like an authority figure, insisting that his decisions were final because they were right, and because Robin's household aligned most closely with those decisions. It naturally received more of his presence, more of his emotional energy. This dynamic created a feedback loop that was impossible to break. The more Cody stayed with Robin, the more disconnected the other wives felt. The more disconnected they felt, the more they questioned the situation. The more they questioned it, the more defensive Cody became. And the more defensive he became, the more tightly he clung to the one place where he felt understood and supported. Over time, the rules stopped feeling temporary. They hardened into a new reality. What was meant to protect the family instead divided it into those who were inside and those who were out. Christine felt the weight of this division most acutely during moments that should have been ordinary. Birthdays celebrated at a distance, conversations conducted through screens, emotional milestones experienced alone. She wasn't just separated from Cody. She was separated from the version of herself that once believed she mattered equally. In the quiet moments, when the cameras weren't rolling and the explanations ran out, she began to ask herself a question she had avoided for years. If love required this much erasure, was it still love at all? Janelle's response was quieter, but no less profound. She began reclaiming autonomy in subtle ways, leaning into work, independence, and self-reliance. If the family structure could no longer provide emotional security, she would provide it for herself. This wasn't rebellion. It was adaptation. A recognition that waiting for fairness had become an exercise in futility. Mary, caught between hope and resignation, lingered in the margins, still tied to the idea of family even as the family moved on without her. The rules gave her a reason to stay distant, but they also removed any remaining illusion that closeness would return on its own. And Robin, often portrayed as overwhelmed by the tension, remained at the center of it all. Whether intentionally or not, her comfort had become the benchmark. Her sense of safety dictated the family's shape. In protecting her from discomfort, the system elevated her needs above the collective. And that elevation changed everything. The most painful part was not the isolation itself, but the refusal to acknowledge its impact. When Christine finally voiced how deeply the rules hurt her, the response was not understanding, but dismissal. She was told she was exaggerating, that she was choosing to feel excluded, that the door was open if she would simply comply. But compliance had stopped being about behavior. It was about surrender. Surrendering the right to question, to feel, to ask for more. And that was a price she could no longer pay. The rules, meant to be neutral, revealed the truth the family had been circling for years. Equality had become conditional. Love had become transactional. And once that realization set in, it changed how every interaction was interpreted. Every visit denied felt intentional. Every justification sounded hollow. Every promise of future balance rang false. By the time the rules began to loosen, the damage was already done. Trust had eroded. Resentment had taken root. The family was still speaking the language of unity, but the lived experience told a different story. What had once been a shared experiment now felt like a hierarchy, enforced not by cruelty, but by consistency. And in that consistency, the cracks widened until the structure could no longer hold. Christine didn't leave in a blaze of anger or with slammed doors and shouted accusations. Her breaking point was quieter than that, slower, almost invisible if you weren't paying close attention. For a long time, she tried to adapt, telling herself that what she was feeling was temporary, that every marriage goes through seasons of distance, that plural marriage required thicker skin and greater sacrifice. She reminded herself of the values she had committed to, the faith she had defended publicly, the family identity she had helped build from the ground up. But over time, something essential inside her began to erode. It wasn't just about Cody spending less time with her. It was about how that time felt when he did show up. Conversations felt rushed, distracted. His body language told a story, his words didn't. Arms crossed, eyes drifting, impatience creeping into his tone. Where he once laughed easily with her, now there was tension, as if her presence itself had become a problem to manage. Christine noticed how carefully she began choosing her words, how often she swallowed thoughts before speaking, afraid that honesty would be interpreted as negativity or disloyalty. Loneliness settled in not as a dramatic ache, but as a constant background hum, present even when the house was full of children. She would sit in familiar rooms and feel strangely out of place, like a guest in a life she had helped create. The hardest moments were the quiet ones, late nights when the kids were asleep, when there was no distraction from the realization that her emotional needs no longer mattered. She wasn't asking for extravagance or special treatment. She was asking to be wanted, to be chosen in some meaningful way. Instead, she felt tolerated. Over time, that distinction became unbearable. Each attempt to express her pain seemed to push Cody further away. He framed her sadness as dissatisfaction, her needs as unreasonable expectations, her tears as proof that she was unhappy by nature rather than hurt by circumstance. The more she tried to explain, the more defensive he became, until she started to question herself. Maybe she was asking too much. Maybe she was failing at plural marriage. That self-doubt kept her frozen longer than she now wishes it had. But there was a moment, small, almost unremarkable from the outside, when something finally snapped into clarity. It wasn't one argument or one rejection. It was the accumulation of being unseen. She realized she was modeling a version of marriage for her children that she wouldn't want for them. She saw how her unhappiness lingered in the air, how her kids sensed it, even when she tried to hide it. And in that realization, something shifted from sadness to resolve. Leaving wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about survival. When she finally said the words out loud, there was grief, yes, but also relief. Cody's reaction revealed more than his words ever could. He seemed less heartbroken by the loss of the relationship than stunned by the loss of control. He questioned her timing, her motives, her loyalty, but rarely paused to ask why she had reached this point. That absence of curiosity was its own answer. Christine didn't leave because she stopped believing in family. She left because she realized she no longer had one in the way that mattered. And once she crossed that emotional threshold, there was no going back. The quiet breaking point, the one no one had taken seriously for years, had finally become the end. When Christine finally spoke the words that had been forming quietly inside her for years, they didn't come out as anger or accusation. They came out steady, almost calm, as if she had already done the hardest part alone. I don't feel safe anymore. It wasn't a dramatic declaration, and that was precisely why it landed so heavily. She wasn't talking about physical danger. She was talking about emotional safety, the kind that allows you to speak honestly without fear of dismissal, the kind that lets you exist without constantly apologizing for your feelings. For a long time, she had tried to convince herself that discomfort was simply part of plural marriage, that personal sacrifice was the price of commitment. But this felt different. This felt like erasure. The more she explained, the clearer it became that safety, for her, meant being heard without being corrected, being valued without being compared, being loved without conditions. And none of that existed anymore. What followed was not empathy, but resistance. Her words were questioned, dissected, reframed. She was told she was rewriting history, exaggerating pain, creating problems where none existed. The irony was devastating. In trying to explain why she didn't feel emotionally safe, she was proving her own point. Each attempt to clarify was met with defensiveness rather than understanding, as if acknowledging her pain would threaten the entire structure holding everything together. The phrase, "I don't feel safe," became a turning point because it stripped away all the justifications that had been used for years. It wasn't about schedules, rules, or logistics anymore. It was about whether a marriage could survive without emotional refuge. Christine realized that staying meant continuing to silence herself for the sake of peace, and leaving meant finally telling the truth, even if it made others uncomfortable. The aftermath was revealing. Instead of reflection, there was accusation. Instead of grief, there was indignation. Cody framed her decision as betrayal rather than self-preservation, as if her need for safety was a personal attack rather than a warning sign. That response confirmed what she had already begun to accept. The relationship no longer had room for her humanity. In choosing to leave, she wasn't rejecting family values. She was choosing herself for the first time in a very long time. And while the decision brought heartbreak and uncertainty, it also brought clarity. She wasn't walking away from love. She was walking away from a situation where love required her to disappear. Once that realization settled in, there was no longer a question of whether she should go, only the quiet understanding that staying would mean losing herself completely. By the time everything reached its final stage, the collapse no longer looked sudden. It looked inevitable. What had once been framed as a complicated but workable family structure now felt like a slow-motion unraveling that everyone had sensed but avoided naming. Christine's departure didn't just remove one wife. It stripped away the last illusion that the system was still balanced. Her absence echoed through every interaction, exposing how fragile the remaining connections truly were. Janelle, watching all of this unfold, didn't rush to dramatic conclusions. She had always been the steady one, the realist, the person who believed endurance could outlast discomfort. But endurance has limits, especially when it starts to feel like self-abandonment. The more she reflected, the clearer it became that her loyalty had been rewarded with expectation, not care. She was strong because she had to be, independent because she couldn't rely on consistency, and patient because speaking up rarely changed outcomes. That realization didn't arrive with anger, it arrived with clarity. Mary, meanwhile, lingered in a space that felt almost suspended in time, emotionally attached to a version of the family that no longer existed. Her silence wasn't acceptance. It was grief without language. She stayed close enough to feel the loss, but far enough to avoid confronting it fully, caught between hope and resignation. And Robin, now unmistakably positioned at the center, carried the weight of a role she may never have consciously sought but ultimately inhabited. Her household had become the emotional anchor, the place where Cody felt understood and validated, and that made everything else feel secondary by comparison. Cody himself appeared increasingly isolated by his own certainty. He framed the breakdown as betrayal, as disloyalty, as others failing to live up to commitments, without fully reckoning with how his choices had shaped those outcomes. In doing so, he missed the deeper truth. Families don't fall apart because people leave. They fall apart because people stop feeling like they belong. What remained at the end wasn't a dramatic explosion, but a quiet reckoning. The experiment that once promised shared love revealed its limits, not through scandal, but through exhaustion. And the question that lingers isn't who was right or wrong, or who tried harder, but whether a system built on equality can survive once that equality becomes conditional. That unanswered question is what continues to pull viewers back, long after the marriages themselves have unraveled.